Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast for Bama 247. I am your host, Cody Goodwin. Got the whole gang here today. Mike Rodak, Alex Scarborough. Guys, Alabama held walk-on tryouts earlier this week, I believe on Tuesday night when it was like, negative 17 degrees outside. I'm curious, if you guys were going to walk on to the Alabama football program, what position would you guys play?
Long snapper. I'd like to be the backup punter. You don't want me in a position to have to do something. That's kind of where I need to be.
So you just want to go to practice and hang out and be on the sidelines during game day. Maybe I don't know. Would a third string punter dress?
I mean, they barely participate in practice. To be fair, it is funny if anybody ever gets the chance to go out to an actual college football practice. The specialists are not doing as much, or what do you think they're going to do? They're off on their own little island,
which is kind of nice. I don't know, Mike. What position would you play as a walk-on?
I've always fancied myself a tight end, but I mean, put me up against Will Anderson on the edge.
Yeah. Are you more of a? What's the best way to describe this?
A Y or an F?
Well, I was gonna are you more of a Travis Kelce or are you more of a Robbie Ouzts?
More of a Miller Forrestal.
Okay, all right. Hey, he's a dirty work guy that had some moments. Okay,
yeah. I like Miller when he was here. He was a very friendly fella.
Does he? I know he's floating around the NFL, but he played for the Rams at some point this year?
Yeah, he was there. I think he was in Cleveland. Yeah, he's been around for a few years now. I mean,
his current team is the Rams. So I don't know if that means practice squad or not, but
Saints, Titans, he's also been around. So no, I like Miller. I mean, never really did much in terms of like stats or anything, but he was a nice guy to talk to when we did.
If I'm on a football field, I'll tell you the job I'd actually like to have, which would be the analytics guy. I want to be the guy with the book that says we go for it on fourth down or not here. I want to know what goes into those decisions a little bit more because some coaches just don't seem to abide by any logic. I do want to put a bow on the walk-on conversation, though. You're not? I'm assuming you'd be a DB. Are you a high safety, Cody, or are you playing the Husky position? Like where are you trying to go?
I'm a pretty versatile DB. I always kind of thought that I would be like a guy that's on the outside. Like a corner, because I'm lanky and
you want to be Goodwin Island. Is that what you're gonna be?
Honestly, yeah. I don't know. I feel like I'm a pretty fluid athlete. I can run if you need me to. I can play man. I can play off coverage a little bit. I feel like I can I grew up a wrestler, so physicality doesn't really bother me all that much. That said, if you got to put me in the slot, I can do that. If you need me to play safety and kind of, play center field a little bit and read the quarterback, I can do that too. I can come down into the box again, the physicality aspect and play the run if you need me to.
Are you so hardcore that when you play NCAA football, you actually play coverage?
No.
Okay.
No. When I play NCAA football, when I'm playing defense, I rush the passer. I set the secondary coverage and then I go pick either a linebacker or defensive end and I try to hunt a matchup. Okay. So I trust my guys on the back end, but if I'm actually physically playing myself, I'm probably a defensive back.
And I not to hijack the show now, but before we get into the other things we had planned to discuss, because I wrote about it yesterday, I wondered if you guys had a take on the way too early rankings and where you think Alabama should be. I know I'm putting you on the spot, but to give you some context, there were the Athletic and CBS both had Alabama 14th. ESPN had them 12th. SI had them 8th. I said they should probably be 9th. I put them just above South Carolina. But I'm curious what you guys thought when you, if and when you saw those early projections.
I have some thoughts. Mike, would you like to go first?
No, Paul Feinbaum asked me the same question yesterday, and I said they're probably a fringe top 10 team. But I was actually just looking. USA Today posted their way too early top 25 for next season. Alabama, not number 1, not number 2, but number 3 from the USA Today. That is Paul Meyerberg and Eric Smith saying that they are well stocked at wide receiver with Ryan Williams, likely to have more impact in the sophomore season. Deontay Lawson, the anchor of a strong defense that has depth in the front 7 and key returners in the secondary.
3's ambitious.
That's high.
Ambitious. That is
high.
Ambitious. I don't know. I mean, like, how good do you think Ty Simpson is? That's how high you're going to put him, basically. That's what it comes down to. So I'm of the belief that if Kalen DeBoer, even in the most dire circumstances last season, did not put Ty Simpson in the game, then there's probably something there to wonder about. I don't know if it's an automatic thing where you get rid of Jalen Milroe and it's addition by subtraction, you're all of a sudden a better team. So I am inclined to put them in the low teens meaning 12, 13, 14, somewhere in there, maybe as high as 11. But, it's all relative to other teams, and a lot of other teams have question marks too, because it's like, who are the best quarterbacks in college football next year? It's one of those things where it's like, is Alabama the best team in the country? No. But you need to figure out who's better. And obviously that starts with the quarterback position. And
does it matter, though? We just saw 2 teams play for a national championship that their quarterbacks weren't the greatest in the world.
While you were on fatherly duties, we had this discussion because
Right.
I posed the question to Mike. Like, neither of the quarterbacks in the national championship game, I don't think many people would call them great quarterbacks.
No.
I don't know that. I don't think Alabama needs great quarterback play in 2025 from Ty Simpson or whoever else comes out of that room as the starter. But saying that is a pretty big bet on everything else, especially with the offense, but really everybody else on the roster. And there might be a few too many questions to think that they can pull that off.
I mean, they weren't the best quarterbacks in the country, neither one of them. Will Howard went 17 of 21 for 231 and 2 touchdowns, no picks, which is pretty good.
He was
Riley
good.
Leonard went 22 of 31 for 255, 2 touchdowns, no picks, which was also pretty good. And had, some early success in the running game, not as much after the first drive. But look, if Notre Dame's playing Drew Pine or playing a Notre Dame quarterback of the past, I don't think they get nearly as far as they did. If Ohio State is playing, I hesitate to say Kyle McCord because he showed something at Syracuse, but if they're playing their backup, was it Devin Brown, I believe his name is?
Yeah. Yes. Well, he transferred out, so Julian Sayin.
Right. It is. And Sayin might be a good player very soon, but it may not be a team that gets as far. So I do think the quarterbacks were important. Again, you're not looking at the best quarterbacks in the country going to the national championship game. That probably would have been Cam Ward being one of them, maybe Shadur being the other, maybe Ewers if you're high on him. I mean, people aren't as much. There's other options for who the other, and that's my point. Like, you got to find better teams. But in terms of, like, we sit here in August and the preseason polls just came out, like, where do I think Alabama will be? I think it's going to be the low teens, maybe as high as like 8 or 9. I think is probably their ceiling for the preseason.
I don't have a huge issue with them being outside the top 10 because there are enough questions on the offense, which I think is going to how the offense plays. If you're asking me way too early, how good are they going to be? I'm going to say it probably depends on the offense, not just the quarterback, but like we've discussed, the offensive line has a few pretty big question marks. What's production look like from the skill guys? They are losing a lot of experience from the tight end room, even though I think a lot of us like what Josh Cuevas brings to the table. I don't know. I feel like there's enough questions there that it's kind of like, yeah, there's a lot of talent. You like where the defense is at, maybe minus the pass rush if you're being a little picky, which we usually are on this pod because we're breaking them down a little bit more in depth than some of those national guys who put out the way too early top 25 polls. But I think if Alabama is any higher than 8th, I'm kind of scratching my head. If they're any lower than, say, 14th or 15th, I'm probably like, who are the 3 or 4 teams in front of them if they're down that low? But anything lower than that, because there is a lot of talent on the roster. Like, the defense is returning all types of experience and talent. They're adding in a lot of really talented guys from their recently added recruiting class, but the questions that they do have are at some pretty key positions in terms of what's gonna stretch the ceiling of this team, which is an easy transition into what we are going to discuss today. Really, this show and the next show, we kind of broke this up into 2 parts. Some way too early questions, big questions, burning questions that we have about Alabama heading into the off season, heading into spring ball, heading into really the 2025 season. I figured this would be a good time on the calendar to just kind of propose these questions and use them to spark discussion about the 2025 Alabama football team. We broke this up into 2 shows, so we're going to discuss the offense today. We're going to discuss the defense probably first thing next week. We assigned everybody a couple of position groups, right? So on the offense, there's quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, offensive line, and then Mike threw in the coaching staff. So we each have 2 position groups that we were tasked with creating a big question, a burning question to spark discussion about Alabama's way too early 2025 prospects. So, Alex, you had quarterback. What is your big burning question when it comes to Alabama's quarterback room heading into 2025?
It's what should I believe? Should I believe what I've seen or should I believe what I've heard? What I've heard is that Ty Simpson is a really good quarterback, that he's a really good leader, that he had a terrific spring, had a terrific fall camp. He's somebody this staff really believes in, somebody this team really believes in. That said, what I've seen is not much of him. To Mike's point earlier, there were moments where Jalen Milroe was awful last year, and it never got very close that they pulled him and put in Ty. And when we saw Ty, he was just okay. He wasn't great. There were moments where when he played the Mercer game, there are moments where he kind of looks out of control a little bit at quarterback. So do I believe what I've heard from the staff, from players, or do I believe what I've seen, which makes me a lot more skeptical? Probably the truth somewhere in the middle. But I think the fate of this team is going to depend a lot upon whether Ty can maximize that potential or not. He's waited a long time for this. I think he does have the tools. I like his athleticism. I like his leadership. I like the fact that he's been in this program a while. But it's, put up or shut up time. So very curious to see which version of Ty Simpson emerges.
Ty Simpson, former 5-star quarterback, has been in the program for 3 seasons. He has seen action in, I believe, 16 total games. He has thrown 50 total passes. And I wonder, Mike, I'll loop you in here. One of the things, I guess, before Jalen Milroe took over before last season was kind of, you talk to people kind of in and around him who have coached him, who've played with him. And it was one of those things where it's like, look, when this guy gets a little bit more playing experience, he will begin to figure things out. Can we make that assumption about Ty Simpson? Like, what do we think about Alabama's quarterback room coming into 2025?
I'll take things at face value in terms of what is there. And in this case, Nick Saban gave Ty Simpson a chance. Well, he really didn't actually. He took Jalen Milroe out of the starting lineup 2 years ago and tried a different quarterback other than Ty Simpson and Tyler Buckner. When Ty Simpson at that point had already had 2 years, it'll be 1 year in the program, but really almost 2 years in terms of the calendar, because he arrived in December of 2021 as borderline 5-star recruit. That would have been September of 2023. So you're talking 21 months-ish. He said, Jalen Milroe looked terrible against Texas in the second half. I'm going to try a different quarterback against South Florida, but I'm not going to try Ty Simpson. I'm going to try Tyler Buckner, the quarterback who just got here from Notre Dame. Granted, there was a Tommy Rees connection. And then Ty Simpson gets his chance in that game. And you know what Nick Saban says? I'm going to go back to Jalen Milroe. And the rest of that year, that was Jalen Milroe. And Kalen DeBoer comes in and says, I'm going to go with Jalen Milroe. Jalen Milroe throws multiple picks at Tennessee, throws multiple picks at Oklahoma, has multiple turnovers in a row against Michigan. And throughout that entire time, Kalen DeBoer says, I'm going to stick with Jalen Milroe. And at that point, Ty Simpson was more than 3 years into being an Alabama quarterback. You have to take things at face value. If Ty Simpson was ready, capable, had the sort of value to a coach to put on the field, it would have happened. These guys aren't dumb. Nick Saban's not dumb. Kalen DeBoer isn't dumb. So if he feels like Jalen Milroe gave him the best chance to win, that has to be a statement about Ty Simpson as well. There's logically no way it's not. and that's not burying Ty. That's not saying he sucks and he's never going to be good ever, but there's something to being 3 years into your tenure and two coaches not putting you on the field when there have been situations that might have warranted it. I can't get past that in my head. And there might be optimism about him. I've seen glimpses and bits and pieces, and a lot of this is late game stuff where they're just handing the ball off. There's been occasional times where he's thrown the ball. You don't necessarily watch him and say, I feel like I'm watching an NFL quarterback, or I feel like I'm watching something that needs to be on the field. So that's where I'm at. But can that change? Yes. It's just 3 years is a long time to not really do much. That's just where I'm at in this particular moment. And it may change in September or October, but in January of 2025, that's where I'm at on him.
To put on my optimist hat, and it's not to say that I think, again, I don't know what to believe with Ty. And I think the truth is probably somewhere in between. Been covering Alabama long enough to have seen Mac Jones as a backup and who waited his turn for a very long time. I gave up on him. He was damn good in 2020. Blake Sims looked awful as a backup quarterback, played other positions, set a record for total offense at Alabama. Why you stick with Jalen Milroe, we've talked about it over and over and over again, about the loyalty aspect of it, about keeping the locker room. I also think there was part of it that was understanding what your offense was capable of and shooting for a quarterback that had the highest ceiling. I think that Jalen Milroe probably, when he's playing best, probably has a higher ceiling than Ty Simpson. The question is, does Ty Simpson have a lower floor? Can he be more consistently good as opposed to being wow great? Because you don't have to be all the time great. And the other part of it is, if you throw Ty Simpson into a game at Oklahoma where they're trailing by double digits, where your season's on the line, and he fails, you might lose him forever. So there's an element of, do you want to set the guy up for success? Do you want him to have a long runway of an entire offseason where he feels like he's competing to be the starting quarterback and goes into game one, if he wins the starting quarterback job, with a good rhythm, with a good feel, with good confidence? Yes, he's been in the program for 3 years, but he's still a young guy. So do you want to set him up for success? Does that negate everything you're saying? Absolutely not. But you can talk yourself into reasons why you would want, A, for the immediate future to stick with Jalen Milroe, and for the long-term future to hold off on throwing Ty into the fire.
I think we could spend the entire podcast discussing quarterbacks, so I'll make this point and then we can move it along. I think there were points early in the 2023 season where we thought, or maybe it was just me, but I feel like there was a shared consensus here that if Alabama's offensive line was better, Ty Simpson would have made a lot more sense as the quarterback over Jalen Milroe, because he just seemed like he was a little bit more of a pure pocket passer. He seemed like he was more of the type that would fit a Saban/Tommy Rees offense. But because the offensive line wasn't great, you want a guy who can maybe create a little bit more out of structure, or who is a little bit more comfortable creating out of structure. And Jalen Milroe gave you that skill set. So while he was maybe a little bit limited in some areas compared to Ty Simpson, I think it was just because, like, hey, if the offensive line breaks down on any given play, this guy gives us a chance to actually make something out of it. Whereas Ty Simpson can be mobile. He's a little bit more, I don't want to say of a statue, but again, a little bit more of that traditional drop back passer. So maybe that was just my thought, but I feel like that was a discussion point we had during the 2023 season, is that the early portion of that season was unfolding, that if the offensive line was better, Ty made a little bit more sense for the offense. Now it's kind of like, okay, like I wonder if that's a similar discussion point that we are going to be having this season, just with the questions on the offensive line. We'll obviously get to that a little bit later in the show, but I do wonder if that's something that's also worth considering.
One not so burning question, but something I've found myself pondering. You've only got 3 quarterbacks in that room right now. What if one of them leaves after the spring? You're in real trouble. So I'm not saying that's going to happen. If Austin would be the most logical person to leave at this point. If he was going to, he probably already would have. But if he's thinking, oh, let me see what spring is like and if I'm in this competition or not, if they don't get a 4th quarterback, I'm going to be very, not surprised necessarily, but intrigued, because it puts you in a very precarious situation at the position.
But it's hard to get a quarterback at this point. I mean, in terms of the portal, I mean, the guys that are left in the portal, you're looking at, not the greatest collection of talent. And that might be what you need to look to, because you're looking at a guy, you're basically telling you're going to come in and be a third or fourth quarterback. And there's only a certain segment of players that want to do that. You could wait and then try to look for guys in the spring if they go into the portal. The two problems with that is you can't have an SEC player, and you're really behind the eight ball in terms of learning the offense at that point. And it's not like you have, I don't know what the Washington situation is now, but I feel like there's enough turnover there that you can't go dip into that pool like you did last year. So it's tough. And I still feel like if you're opening Pandora's box with that topic, I agree. Austin Mack would clearly be the player you'd watch for. But if Keelan Russell comes in the spring and lights it up, and Ty Simpson sees some writing on the wall that maybe this is not my job, would there be logic in Ty Simpson leaving after the spring? I think that would, there's dominoes falling hypothetically there, but that would be an interesting situation if that ever unfolded that way. Not saying it would. I'm just playing out the hypothetical. But yeah, I agree. You might need a third quarterback at some point. It's probably going to be junior college or, kind of a borderline walk-on sort of player. And just, if you ever get to the point where you need to play him, you're probably screwed anyway. And you're just going to have a guy who can throw the ball in there.
The running backs, big questions, burning questions about the running backs. This was my position group. And my big question is really usage. Like, how are these guys going to be used? Last year, they were kind of used more so as leading blockers as opposed to like traditional running backs. You look at Alabama's rushing numbers. Obviously, Jalen Milroe topped the rushing attempts, which I think in hindsight, maybe we probably should have seen coming a little bit. But I think in the preseason and really all throughout the offseason, I think we were pretty optimistic that the running backs would get a lot of run in a Kalen DeBoer offense. He was really excited. Kalen was about the idea of jam and justice. He really liked what they had in Richard Young. And as the season unfolded, more and more, the offense went through Jalen Milroe, for better or for worse. He had 168 rushing attempts. Jam Miller was next with 145, and then Justice Haynes didn't even crack 80. So my question is now, with probably a more traditional drop back passer behind center, how are these guys going to be used? Is it going to be similar to when Washington had Dylan Johnson, where he was kind of the bell cow running back? He was the guy that ran for almost 1,200 yards, scored 16 rushing touchdowns. Granted, that was behind the Joe Moore award-winning offensive line. I'm not sure that Alabama is going to have that, at least at this way too early juncture in 2025. But, he was a guy that also came out of the backfield and caught a handful of passes every now and again. We didn't really see that a ton from Alabama this past season. I think Jam Miller was the leading pass catcher out of the running back room, only 16 receptions, 155 yards, about 10 yards a catch. But then you'd have to go all the way down. Justice Haynes, 17 catches. And then after that, not really, Kevin Riley had a couple of catches in probably garbage time in the fourth quarter of probably the Mercer game. So my question is usage. You go back to Kalen DeBoer's offense when he was at Washington, when he was at Fresno State, they really only had like one running back at both of those stops. There are, I think, multiple guys within Alabama's running back room that can do some things. There's a lot of excitement, I think, or a lot of intrigue is probably the better word when you look at Jam Miller, who has shown that he can be versatile, but just maybe isn't always given the volume. You've got a guy like Richard Young, who I'm particularly pretty high on. He seems like a guy that's got good vision, can make those cuts. He's a little bit bigger, a little bit of a bruiser. You've also got, our guy Dan Mountain, Daniel Hill, Kevin Riley, the local guy. They're bringing in AK Deer. They brought in a transfer in Draylon Washington. That's my big question about the running backs coming into 2025 is just usage. How are these guys going to be used? How are they going to be utilized? Are they each going to have kind of different skill sets, or is it going to be one of those where the offense is such that you can kind of plug in whenever, whoever, however, and they can all kind of play the same role? That's my big question on the running backs. What do you guys think?
To have a feature back, I think you need a guy who needs to be featured. And as much as I like Jam Miller's skill set, he's not proven that quite yet. He's a guy who has a lot of very athletic. He can run hard, but I've seen him run into tackles one too many times. I think a big question is, how does it change with Jalen Milroe out of the offense? Does it open things up for those guys? I think they have interesting options at running back. The addition of Draylon Washington from Louisiana is very interesting to me. because they've lacked a true home run hitter, and he's shown that ability at times. AK Deer is the biggest question mark. But as Mike likes to talk about with receivers, there's only so many carries to go around. So if we're going to talk about 5 running backs, they're not going to feature 5 running backs. Who can separate themselves and be worthy of getting those carries? I think that is an open question, to say the least. And as much as Jam is going to be the front runner to be the leading ball carrier this year, I don't think anything is necessarily set in stone, because there's opportunity for growth for a lot of those guys, and frankly, some left to show for guys who've been in the program a little bit longer.
I think that there's too much credit given to Jam Miller. That's my conclusion, quite frankly, on that. A player that I think a lot of people have liked in stretches, but I'm currently pulling up stats for last season. First, I'm limiting it to first and second downs. That's when you need to be able to have a traditional run game. I'm limiting it to 4 yards or more to go. So you're taking out short yardage situations. First and second downs with more than 4 yards to go. And this is players who have at least 5 carries per game. In terms of yards per rush in those situations, Jam Miller was 159th in the country last season at 5 yards per carry in those situations. Justice Haynes was actually 87th at 5.9. So in a traditional running situation, when it's first or second down, it's not a short yardage situation, Justice Haynes was more productive than Jam Miller. In terms of in those situations, how many times did Jam Miller run for a first down? And it's first and 10, it's second and 8, it's second and 6 even. Does Jam Miller get the ball and run for a first down? Not very often. So in terms of his percentage of first down runs in those situations, 277th in the country, 13% of the time. That's all. As a comparison, you want to look at a player that I think we all just saw, Travion Henderson, 42nd in the country, 25% of the time. So Travion Henderson in a traditional running situation got a first down more than double or almost double the amount of time as Jam Miller. Jeremiah Love was close to 20% himself in terms of, again, these guys we just watched. Ashton Genty was about 20%. So that's lagging way behind. I think the standard that you need to be an offense, a running game that is capable of doing something as a team. So, Justice Haynes was 260th in the country, 14% of the time he ran for a first down in those situations. So it's not good enough. I mean, maybe you get some help. Draylon Washington, 193rd in the country at Louisiana last year, 17% of the time he ran for a first down in those situations. Jalen Milroe was much more effective at that. He took the ball 22% of the time, 83rd in the country, ran for a first down. So Jam Miller is way too low on that list for me to just hand him the keys to the car as a senior next year and say this offense needs to run through you. Like, is there not a better option? How much of that was the offensive line? I don't know. There's also a stat, yards before contact, which is sometimes used to kind of drill down and say how much push is the offensive line giving you before you're even contacted. And that page is still loading, but I will get you that number in just a second. But my overall case is I feel like you can upgrade strongly from Jam Miller, and it just was an underrated part last year that just wasn't good enough. So he was at 2.25 yards before contact, and
that's not great.
There's other backs that. Where's Jarquez Hunter? I think he was higher on that list. He was about 2.6, but Hunter was much higher on the first down percentage, was much higher in the yards per rush in situations. Another back that I think performed a lot better than Jam Miller did last year.
Well, so I'll pose another thought or question when it comes to the running back room. I think there was really across the board. I mean, we especially saw this at quarterback with Jalen Milroe, just the idea of loyalty from Kalen DeBoer and just kind of riding with his guys for better or for worse. Assuming that he's not married to that idea this season, especially at quarterback. Mike, I know you've made that point that he doesn't need to be anymore. Now it's about winning games and kind of doing your thing. Could we see something similar with the running back room? Like, does Jam Miller, like if Jam Miller is not running back one coming out of spring, I would think that that's potentially a good thing, whether it's Traylon Washington climbing the depth chart, whether it's Richard Young taking steps forward, whether it's some of those younger guys, Daniel Hill, maybe even AK Deer improving a little bit. Like that's, like would we still be worried about the running back room or maybe skeptical about the running back room if Jam Miller is still at the top of the depth chart after spring?
I mean, I'll still be skeptical, but I don't think it'll be a bad thing. I don't think their production is not so much that you say, oh my God, it's going to fall off a cliff. There's not much further to fall because they haven't been reliably productive. And again, the question is, does simply subtracting Jalen Milroe make for a different offense that fixes those things? I don't think it's as simple as that. I think there's talent back there, but it's not proven talent. So they've got to figure it out. Again, that's why I think the wild card in all this is AK Deer and how quickly he can get up to speed, because he's got special characteristics. It's just hard to throw a freshman in there. But if you're going to do it, running back's not a bad spot. You just kind of worry about pass protection, but that's going down a whole other road.
It would be the first time in a little while we've seen a truly special freshman running back or a young running back actually pan out for Alabama, because Justice Haynes did not, as a 5-star player that we all expected to be great. Before him, Kamar Wheaton would be another 5-star player who never played for them. Kind of went off into cyberspace pretty quickly. You probably have to go back to even Najee as a freshman in his first couple of years was not. He has a really highly recruited kid, was not all that productive very early on. So
because their running back room was so stacked,
right, different.
Get on the field.
And that leads me to my second point, and this can wrap up the running back discussion. I don't mean to pull it out too long, but like a couple years ago, 2021, Brian Robinson was average for Alabama. I don't think he was great. They got the job done. That Cincinnati game in Dallas, he certainly was good. But then that offseason, they went out and they got Jahmyr Gibbs from Georgia Tech. Ends up being a great player for Alabama, even better player in the NFL. That hasn't happened the last couple of years at Alabama. Their best running back that was available was Quinshon Judkins last year. And he goes to Ohio State instead of Alabama. So what's happened to Alabama's ability to bring in that sort of player through the transfer portal? At the very beginning of the portal, they did that with Gibbs and J-Mo Williams and Henry To'oTo'o, but their ability to do that now seems diminished. And this is a position where if there was that sort of player out there, just doesn't seem like they're in the market for that realistically.
So how they will be used, but then also their effectiveness in whatever that role looks like, I think is the big question when it comes to the running backs. Mike, you had receivers. What's your way too early big question on Alabama's receivers?
How much of Ryan Williams' lack of production in the second half of the season was due to Jalen Milroe and the constriction of the offense, the retraction of the offense, whatever you want to call it, whatever happened from what we saw at Wisconsin and the ability, even before that Western Kentucky game, and the ability for that offense to have the deep ball, the Georgia game would be included, to what it was by the end of the year, which was something totally different. How much of that was the circumstances surrounding Ryan Williams, and how much of that was Ryan Williams himself and drops or lack of concentration and things that kind of cropped up multiple times. There was the drop that he had against Vanderbilt. That was a pretty key one. I can picture it down the right sideline. That was one I think Kalen DeBoer even mentioned, like you got to catch the ball and then turn. There were some other ones later in the season. There was a couple snafus and punt returning and punt decision-making that were problematic with him. And again, you kind of look at the second half of the season, I'll roughly call it October 26th, which was, I believe, the Missouri game, through the rest of the year. Ryan Williams, in terms of his yards per reception, 12.7. That ranks 191st in the country over that time span. Yards per game over that time span, October 26th through the bowl game, he had 36 yards per game, which is
not good.
275th in the country. And this is a player that a month into the season sorry, Alex, to call you out. We were saying, is he going to win the Heisman?
I don't feel bad about that take. He was looking like he should have been a Heisman finalist.
Right. And still was a Biletnikoff semifinalist somehow.
National people stop paying attention at a certain point, and they just retain whatever they have.
Right. I mean, the catches against Georgia, I think, did wonders for his publicity and all that.
Wisconsin, too.
Yeah. Yeah. And, there's a couple after that. I think he had a touchdown against Vandy.
Down the sideline. Yeah.
But 275th in the country in receiving yards per game from October 26th on. Just, it wasn't there production-wise.
Yeah.
And I'm not willing to just totally lay that at the feet of Jalen Milroe or lay that at the feet of Nick Sheridan. Jeremy Bernard was 82nd in the country, which is much better, 68.8 yards per game. And yards per reception, Jeremy was at 16.5 as opposed to Ryan at 12.7. So there was more bang for your buck and more yards per game from Jeremy. So the yards were available. They were there. Were teams keying on Ryan Williams? There's probably more attention being paid to him as they saw more of him, but that's going to be true for him going forward too. So you got to be able to overcome that. And that's the biggest question to me is like, everybody's expecting big things out of Ryan Williams, but is it just a continuation of what we saw in the second half of the season, which is not nearly going to be good enough for this offense?
Is it? I agree with what you're saying. I think this staff has got to get the most out of Ryan Williams. You need a star receiver. Not to make everything about the team that just won a national championship. Ohio State's ability to turn to Jeremiah Smith in moments of need was enormous. Is it more important that Ryan Williams goes over 1,000 yards or that you get consistently good production from the third and fourth receivers? Which is going to show more for the ability of this offense to take the next step? I would argue it's the depth at receiver, and you need more out of those positions in order to give the defense more to account for. Because all the defense had to worry about was Jalen Milroe running and Jeremy Bernard and Ryan Williams. That's basically all they were worried about going into games. There are other players who could hurt you, but not consistently. You've got to get the production across the board for everybody to be better. Now, is that me sitting here being more optimistic that Ryan Williams will have a really good sophomore season? Sure. But I do think it's equally, if not more important, to get production from those third and fourth receivers, because that was just not happening last season.
Ryan Williams getting 1,000 yards type thing, like him being the featured primary receiver, to use the Ohio State example, Ryan Williams being Jeremiah Smith, that stretches the ceiling of the offense. But I think whether it's Horton, Cole Adams, Jalen Hale, Rico Scott, Jalen Mbakwe, the production of wide receiver 3, 4, 5 raises the floor of the operation. And I think you need both, but I think I would argue that raising the floor of the operation is a little bit more important this year with what will likely be a first-year quarterback behind center.
But it's a zero-sum game in terms of snaps. And so if your third or fourth receiver is on the field or your fifth receiver, there's only two ways they're getting on the field. Number one, you're taking Ryan Williams or Jeremy Bernard off the field, or both, to have a third or fourth receiver, which they did at some points, especially early last season. I think to some people's chagrin, like there's a lot of rotation. And that's one way. And the other way is you're taking one or both of your tight ends off the field. And the biggest implication of that is going to be pass protection, because you take a tight end off the field, whether it's Cuevas, whether it's Danny Lewis, whether it's both, if you're trying to get four receivers on the field, assuming you're keeping a running back, you're putting your tackles on an island. And that is a big question for the right tackle spot in particular with Wilkin Formby, and you have no tight end protection next to him. I think it's still probably a question mark to some degree with Caden Proctor, who I can picture one play in a Michigan game got beat. Can you even get the ball out to those third or fourth receivers? So, it's all interconnected. And this staff last season showed a pretty strong willingness to have two tight ends in the field a lot, because I think they liked what Ouzts and Dupree brought from a pass protection, from a run blocking standpoint with what they're trying to do. And, you also have a quarterback that, if there is pressure, is he able to make the same sort of plays as Jalen Milroe? Probably not as a scrambler. I don't think you're going to get as much of that from Ty. I think the benefit you might get from Ty in those situations is him getting the ball out more quickly and finding the right receiver and getting hot reads and things out that needs to happen at the snap. So again, it's all interconnected, and there's only two ways to get a third or fourth receiver on the field. You either take your first or second one off, or you take your tight ends off. And that will be the question to me on how that happens.
Alex, you had tight ends. What's your big question regarding Alabama's tight end room?
Is there more or less production from the group than there was a year ago? A year ago, I mean, less than a year ago now, obviously. But you had two really good veteran options at tight end, and I'm including H back there when you talk about Robbie Ouzts and CJ Dupree. They were limited athletically, though. I wonder if they can take a step forward in that direction, bringing Danny Lewis more into the fold. Cuevas is a really good H-back type at that position. To Mike's point, I did pull up the numbers really quickly. Alabama ran two tight ends 31.4% of the time. That's a pretty big number. That's 40th in the country. They did an awful lot. And does that change by bringing in a guy like Isaiah Horton, who I don't know how you sell a guy like that who had 56 catches at Miami a year ago to come to Alabama if you think you're going to continue not playing three receivers like you have. So very curious how much that position changes because of the huge loss of experience there. Again, I like Cuevas. He played quite a bit for being the third tight end in that mix. Had reliable hands, I thought, when the ball did go his way. Danny Lewis is a question mark. And then, of course, the freshman, when you're talking about Pritchett and Edwards, you like the size, you like, what's there to build on, but it's really hard for freshman tight ends to play in the SEC, let alone at the Power 4 level. So will we see fewer two tight end sets? I wonder.
The Alabama tight end room combined in 2024 for 47 catches, 592 yards, 3 touchdowns. If you go back, I don't always like doing this because all personnel is different, but if you go back to the Washington team that got to the national championship a couple years ago, Jack Westover, who was kind of the fourth receiving target in that offense behind Odunze, Polk, and McMillan, 46 catches, 433 yards, 4 touchdowns. So is it going to be another by committee approach? Is this going to be the year where maybe Josh Cuevas steps up and becomes the primary tight end? I believe they also had Devin Culp in that offense, who was behind Jeremy as like the 6th pass catching option in that Washington offense. When it comes to production, I also wonder like the shift in the offense, right? Like I think a lot of us, again, maybe this is just me, but I feel like we've talked about this, like with more of a traditional pass first quarterback behind center, does that allow DeBoer to go back to the offense that he has traditionally run everywhere else? And what does that mean for the tight end specifically? I'd like to think that means like Josh Cuevas is just going to get a ton of run, right? Because especially like he's been in the offense now for a few years. He knows the offense. Not that like featured tight end is a role, but like I know that that's something that we've seen, not necessarily from Alabama, but just like in football in general. Like sometimes you just have this one tight end who can do a lot of different things. So I don't know. I've always viewed Cuevas as a little bit more of a pass catching tight end. And I wonder if if the offense is closer to what we think the offense is going to look like this season, if he's just going to be that guy and get a lot more run while the rest of them maybe develop behind the scenes.
You talk about feature tight ends. That's the weird thing about covering Alabama for over a decade now. And this is not a Kalen DeBoer thing. They've never really had that. Even when they had O.J. Howard, who I think is probably the most athletic, productive tight end that they had, they would just go away from him for long stretches of time. Shout out Amari Niblack. Didn't work.
Cam Latu in the red zone was probably their most productive tight end that I can think of.
Like you
Herb
see
Smith.
Kyle Pitts, you see Brock Bowers, you see
Tyler Warren.
You see who was the Michigan tight end this year who was really
Loveland.
You see that the way that position over the last 2 decades has evolved to become way more athletic and really be a cheat code for defensive coordinators because they're matchup nightmares, and the inability for Alabama to find those guys and develop them and turn them into that has been strange. Will they eventually land on one of them? Does Pritchett or Edwards develop into that guy? Does Danny Lewis or Josh Cuevas develop into that guy? I don't know. It's just been weird. Like maybe it's emblematic of nothing, but it's weird that Alabama's never really hit on one of those. And I always wondered if they find one of those guys, and you just think, can you pair somebody like that with a Ryan Williams, with a Jeremy Bernard, how dangerous that could be. Instead, it seems like they're continuing down that track of tight ends who can catch the football, but really live with their hand in the dirt and are more blocking oriented. It's not a bad way to go. It's just it's a choice.
The offensive line was mine. I think the big question I have here is who's starting at right tackle. Like that is a glaring hole at the moment after Elijah Pritchett hit the transfer portal and on his way to Nebraska. Your current, I don't know, combatants, I suppose, for the starting right tackle job is Wilkin Formby, who we saw struggle quite a bit last season. Arkel Anugwam, who is the Ball State transfer, and then a handful of freshmen or redshirt freshmen, right? Mike, you've made the point that maybe this is a position where Casey Poe gets some run. You've also got dual sport guy with Jackson Lloyd coming in. A lot of just younger, unproven guys. I think you can lightly pencil in Wilkin Formby as the starting right tackle, like at the moment right now, but I don't know that anybody particularly feels good about that. I know it's not the only question on the offensive line. Left guard, you're replacing Tyler Booker, who's going to be a first-round draft pick later this spring. Generally speaking, I know some people might feel differently. I feel pretty good about whether it's Cam Dewberry, who was the Texas A&M transfer, or Michael Carroll. I'm pretty high on that guy. I don't know that I'm necessarily as worried at left guard as I am about right tackle. I think that's the biggest question right now when you're looking at way too early Alabama 2025, just because we've seen bad tackle play derail to anything that the offense is really trying to do. So who's your guy at right tackle? Are they good enough? Can Wilkin Formby improve enough? Are the freshmen ready to go? Are the younger guys ready to go who haven't played a whole lot? That to me is the biggest question and could really have a huge impact on how Alabama's 2025 offense looks.
It would be quite the ascension for Arkel Anugwam to be starting in the SEC, having played in, I believe, 2 games last year at Ball State, started 1 game, the final game of the season. His freshman year at Ball State, he did not play. And his senior year of high school was his first year playing football. And I'm not even sure he played the full year there. So you can count on 2 hands the amount of games he's played in football, period. Not just college football or SEC football, but football. So for him to start at right tackle, I think would be pretty surprising to me. I think he's a guy that you're looking at as a project, so to speak, in terms of his measurables, and a guy that, was obviously very willing to come through the portal and very willing to potentially play that role as a backup. And you can't always get a guy to do that. And that it helps when players are willing to come and you're not having to guarantee them a starting role. So to me, I would be surprised if it's not Wilkin Formby at right tackle against Florida State, unless there's some better option that makes itself available in the spring. But I think every team would love that to happen. And if there is a very good offensive tackle in the market, there's going to be a lot of competition for him. So that's what you got. It's Wilkin Formby. I would be surprised if it's not him.
If Arkel becomes a competent SEC starter in his first year in the program, Courtney Morgan should be an NFL general manager at that point, because that's the ultimate, like, you just moneyballed the shit out of college football if you found that guy and you turned him in that period of time. To Mike's point, it's probably going to be a project. You're probably looking at over a year before you really even consider, can he play the game? To that point, though, when we talk about Wilkin Formby, there are 2 things. One, let's remember, pretty sure he was a redshirt freshman this past season. And I'm pretty sure after that awful, it was South Florida, right?
Yes.
The South Florida game. After that awful performance, he was better the second half of the season. He was not a liability at the very least. So I think you got to give the guy a little bit of room for growth. I think you may be counting out Gino Vandemark a little bit in terms of the guard position. I don't think you bring a guy like that in just to be a 2-year backup. I think you want him to at least compete for one of those guard positions. And again, I feel like I'm always trying to be the optimist here. You had Caden Proctor playing with one arm behind his back for pretty much the entire season. You had Jaden Roberts playing through an injury on and off for a large chunk of the season. It's a big if, but if you get those guys healthy, you know what you have in Parker Brailsford. I'm not saying that right tackle isn't still a huge position that they need to get good production out of. Same with left guard. But there's opportunity to improve there when you just talk about getting those guys healthy. Because I still believe that if Caden Proctor figures it out in terms of health, staying in shape, mental, all that stuff, That dude's a first-round pick. And if you get that out of him in his money year as a junior who can go to the NFL, that would make a huge difference for the offensive line if he can play to the level that I and others think he's capable of.
Yeah, I mean, as of right now, if you're looking at way too early 2026 mock drafts, Caden Proctor is right now the only Alabama player I would realistically consider to be a potential first-round pick. If he has a really good year, he has the measurables, I can see him being a first-round pick just based on his profile. There's a lot of other candidates that I think could be day 2 type of picks. Maybe they elevate it to day 1, but Caden Proctor is probably your top draft prospect for 2026 as it stands. But, we talk about injuries, Proctor's shoulder, Roberts' ankle. My question is, what's the next one? Because if you lose Wokenformy, who's your next tackle up? Like, if you lose Brailsford, you're starting Vandemark, but there's always a next injury, and you're always trying to find that depth somewhere else, or it's thin somewhere, and you're needing to tap into different players. So it's always a game of whack-a-mole when it comes to that. You might get Proctor healthy, but somebody else might go down, and you're just having to kind of chase your tail around a little bit.
Depth on the offensive line is also maybe a little less than ideal when you're looking at it on paper. But if the A team shows up, and I'll give Wokenformy this credit. I wanted to look this up. I mean, he played less than 300 snaps this year. This is according to Pro Football Focus. He allowed 10 total pressures. 5 of them were in that South Florida game. So he got quite a bit of run against Mercer, whatever. He got quite a bit of run against Auburn, played pretty well. And then he did play quite a lot in the bowl game and held up pretty well. So maybe it's one of those things where just with more experience, he will settle in a little bit. And, I don't know that they need All-American play at right tackle, but they just need somebody competent who can do the job 8-9 times out of 10. So if he can become that, I think that definitely will bolster Alabama's offensive line. But yeah, the right tackle spot, I think that's my biggest question, at least as it stands right now. We'll obviously get into spring ball and think a little bit more. Last topic on big questions regarding the offense. Mike, you had the coaching staff. What is your big question for Alabama's offensive coaching staff?
I think we all know the big question there is, does it include Ryan Grubb or not? It's January 23rd, and it's all quiet on the Ryan Grubb Western Front. And Nick Sheridan's still out on the road recruiting with Kalen DeBoer. It's not like, as everybody seemed to expect or think was going to happen, that as soon as Ryan Grubb became available, the Nick Sheridan was going to be left on the side of McFarland Boulevard and have a suitcase next to him, and Ryan Grubb was going to be moving into his office and within the day. And it never seemed like it was going to happen like that. So if it's the right situation for both sides, then maybe we'll see something. And I still tend to doubt whether that is Ryan Grubb with the title of offensive coordinator calling plays. So, we've talked about it before in the show, but it's one of the preeminent topics of this offseason for Alabama, or at least for this month. I mean, it could, be gone here in a matter of days or weeks, but the deeper we get into the month of January, the closer we get to spring practice, what's happening there, I think is the question. So as of right now, it seems like the coaching staff offensively is going to be back as it was. I have not seen any changes, even on the analyst level, like John McNulty and Braxton Barker and Mitch Dolan, the guys who have worked with the offense since last season. I have not seen any movement on their end as well. So it just kind of is as it's been.
I know we've discussed this previously, but I don't know. Ryan Grubb seems to have a lot of options available to him, and I wouldn't blame him one bit for exploring all of those options, right? He's a guy with an offensive line background, if I remember correctly. So could he be looking to stay in the NFL either as some sort of play caller? Because we mentioned before, he did a lot of really good stuff, I thought, with Seattle's pass game, maybe not so much the run game because the offensive line was not very good this year. Could he be looking to stay in the NFL? Could he be looking to stay in the NFL as a offensive line coach, as a quarterbacks coach? Could he potentially, I don't know that there's open availability on Washington staff if he wanted to stay up in the Seattle area. I think Jed Fish and his offensive coordinator, forget who the name is, Brennan Carroll. I'm not sure that they're probably trying to shake things up too much anymore. Does he want to be a offensive coordinator at the collegiate level? And if so, it's probably not just Alabama. There's probably a lot of people that would be interviewing him for his services if, he wanted to go back to the collegiate level because of what he was able to do both at Fresno and at Washington under DeBoer. So I don't know that it's a full lock that he would just walk right back to, into Kalen's open arms, as fun as that would probably be. But this guy probably has a lot of options on the table. And I don't blame him for exploring any of them.
This is just me reading between the lines, but if he was going to be a college offensive coordinator, I think he'd already be one by now. I think the openings that have been there have already come and gone. I think Nick Sheridan being on the road, recruiting as much as he has, tells you everything he needs to know about what Kalen has told him about his place on the staff. So I think it comes down to, does he want to be an NFL coach in some form of fashion, or does he want to go to Alabama and be likely, I think at this point, an analyst? Maybe you can squeeze him being a, some title that's not necessarily out recruiting, because you can sort of work within those constraints now. But I think those are the two likeliest outcomes. And I think the longer this goes, it says to me that he's waiting to see what his options are as it relates to the NFL, because he doesn't really have to rush anything in terms of college. I think he knows if he wants to go to Alabama, there's probably a spot for him. It's not going to be offensive coordinator taking Nick Sheridan's place, but I think they'd find a home for him. So I thought if it was going to happen in the way people predicted quickly, in terms of just, he was replacing Nick Sheridan, that would have happened in 3 days. We're ending week 3 of this now. I think that tells you everything you need to know.
There's no opening. I mean, you have Nick Sheridan as offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach, which it's not often that you separate those titles in college. It's happened a few times with Alabama historically. I think Dan Enos was a quarterbacks coach one year when there was a different offensive coordinator, but you want your offensive coordinator to be in the quarterback's room every day, being the guy leading the charge. So two different people talking to the quarterbacks. Like, sometimes it makes sense to have just a singular message. And they already have, like I said, Mitch Dolan, who's their offensive analyst who works with the quarterbacks. They have Braxton Barker, who's a former walk-on quarterback who works with the tight ends. They already have an offensive line assistant, Kirk Barron, which Ryan Grubb does have a little bit of background as an offensive line coach. I just don't know where it is. I mean, your wide receiver, you have Torrey Gill, who's your assistant wide receivers coach, the analyst to work with Jamarcus Shepard. So if it does happen, I would expect it to be something like a special assistant to the head coach, like what they did with Chuck Morrell last year. And then you see where things are a year down the road. And in that case, Morrell ended up being officially a position coach now, but it's like Jeremy Pruitt. Like, people are still asking about Jeremy Pruitt and where he is and if he'll come back to be the DC. And like, Alabama fans and their fascination with Ryan Grubb is a little over the top to me. That's just
just to underline it again. They can add him and make him do a million different things and him not taking up position coach title. Because look at Tom Allen at Clemson. He's not going to recruit. He's a defensive coordinator who will not be an off-campus recruiter. So how's his job any different than an analyst now? It's not. So if they want to get creative with Ryan Grubb, they could bring him in and have him coach a position and still not be an on-field coach in the way we generally think of it. So there are a bunch of different ways it can still go, though. I mean, and again, the Allen example, I think, is telling about where this could go with coaches, especially as the demands on them as it relates to recruiting just increase and increase and increase. Guys who are in demand who don't really want to do those types of things have more options now.
I agree. Be interesting to see the longer it goes. I wonder if I don't know. I hate to say that Alabama's probably the fallback, but I would imagine the longer it goes, the more that is more likely the case, if it is in the cards at all for Ryan Grubb, if he susses out every other opportunity that comes his way and ends up as an analyst for Alabama sometime next month, March, whenever the case may be. It's probably because none of the other opportunities either fit, or he just didn't like them, or it's almost like hey, I know I can go coach with Kalen, right? So like let's see kind of what else we got going on here. I don't know. That could be potentially it. That could maybe not be it. Maybe he's done with college ball after a year in the NFL. I don't know.
There's out the year.
If you
could do that too.
If you want to be really cynical about it, there might be part of him that just says, I want to make Seattle pay me my contract. And, if there's not a way I can get another job and still get it, I'll just sit and hang out for a year and recharge. The contract language and the money still on the table for him, I don't think is something you can just wave away and say it doesn't matter.
NFL money is a little bit different than college football money. So that is a good point as well. That was really all we had for today's show. Just big questions regarding Alabama's offense in our continuous way too early look at Alabama for 2025. We'll be back next week to do the same thing with the defensive position groups and coaching staff. One big question on each of those as we inch a little bit closer to spring ball and make our way through the off season. So appreciate you guys for listening. Be sure to rate and review this show wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, even our Bama 247 YouTube page. Subscribe to Bama 247 and 24/7 Sports so you can get all of our great coverage regarding the Crimson Tide, more off-season football talk, as well as some basketball coverage here and there. Alabama had a big win over Vanderbilt, 103-87 on Tuesday, their 600-point game so far this season. Pretty impressive considering that they're still struggling to shoot the deep ball. They play LSU at home on Saturday. I believe that game's at 7:30 p.m. Also going to be on SEC Network if you can't get to Coleman Coliseum. We'll be in the building for that game. It's another reason you guys need to subscribe to Bama 247. As always, we appreciate you guys for listening. We'll talk to you all again soon.